You stole it. Those 3 words hit me before I even understood what room I was walking into. I had come home from work the same way I always did. Tired, quiet, ready for a simple evening. Instead, I walked into a kitchen that felt like a courtroom that had already reached its verdict. My sister Petra was crying. Not soft, quiet tears. The full kind, shaking shoulders, hands pressed to her face. The performance of someone who had been waiting for an audience. My mother stood gripping the kitchen counter with both hands, her jaw tight. Her eyes already past me like she was looking at someone she didn't recognize anymore. My father was the worst part. He wasn't yelling. He was just looking at me with that flat, decided expression that meant the conversation in his head had already finished. I didn't. I started. Stop lying. My mother's voice cut clean across mine. We saw the transfer. It's right there in black and white. I looked around the kitchen and that was when I noticed my suitcase. It was already by the door. Standing upright and ready. I hadn't packed it. I didn't even remember it being brought down from my room. My father walked to the front door and opened it. He didn't shout. He didn't point. He just said very quietly, "Get out before I call the police." I stood there. I tried to find words. There weren't any. So I walked out. And the door locked behind me. I stood on the porch for a long moment, holding my suitcase handle with one hand and my phone with the other, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The street was completely ordinary. Car drove past slowly. A dog barked somewhere 2 houses down. The evening light was turning everything that familiar orange color that used to mean dinner was almost ready. None of it made any sense. My parents had just thrown me out of the house I had lived in for 2 years while I saved money and helped with bills and fixed things when things broke. They had thrown me out with a suitcase I hadn't packed, based on an accusation I hadn't heard the full details of, and they hadn't asked me a single question. Not one. My voice cracked when I finally said it out loud. Not from guilt. From pure, bewildered disbelief. They think I stole from my own sister. I looked back at the house. The curtain in the front window shifted slightly. Someone was watching me stand there. My parents threw me out after believing my sister's accusation. Just like that. No investigation. No conversation. No pause long enough to ask whether any of it could possibly be wrong. They didn't even ask me if it was true. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down at the screen. A notification from my bank. An account activity alert. My stomach dropped. My name is Avery Lane. I'm 26 years old. I have never stolen anything in my life. I want to be clear about that from the beginning because the rest of this story only makes sense if you understand who I was before that evening. I was the steady one. Careful one. The daughter who set reminders for bill payments and kept a spreadsheet for monthly expenses and read every document before signing it. I had worked at the same company for 3 years, never been late without notice, never borrowed money I didn't pay back. I was not perfect. No one is. But I was honest. Consistently, almost boringly honest, in the way that people who grew up with very little tend to be because they understand what it costs when trust breaks. And somehow, in the span of 5 minutes in a kitchen where nobody asked me a single question, I had become the easiest person in my family to blame. I stood on that porch with my suitcase and tried to understand how I had gotten here. The answer I kept coming back to wasn't about money or bank transfers or whatever evidence my mother thought she had seen. The answer was simpler and older than any of that. In my family, there was one person whose word was automatically believed. And that person was not me. Had never been me. My sister Petra was 3 years younger than me and had spent most of those years being carefully protected from the sharper edges of the world. When Petra cried, people moved. When Petra struggled, solutions appeared. When Petra made a mistake, and she made plenty of them, the family gathered around her like a shield and the conversation turned quickly to what had caused her difficulty, never to the difficulty itself. I understood it in a distant sort of way. Petra had gone through a genuinely hard time when she was 17. Something happened that the family never fully discussed and never fully resolved. And my parents had responded by building a permanent structure of softness around her that was supposed to be temporary but never was. I had been told to be understanding. So I was. Year after year, quietly and without complaint, I was understanding. I gave her my old laptop when hers broke. I covered her share of a family meal when she said she'd forgotten her card. I listened to her problems at 11 o'clock at night and offered advice she rarely took. I did all of it because she was my sister, and that was what sisters did. What I didn't understand until I was standing on that porch with a packed suitcase was that the structure my parents had built around Petra hadn't just protected her from the world. It had protected her from consequences. And that night she hadn't just accused me. She had known exactly who would be believed. I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before I started the engine. I needed to think before I moved. Moving without thinking was how you made things worse. I opened my banking app and went through every transaction in the last 30 days. Everything was exactly as it should be. My rent contribution transferred on the 1st. My grocery run last Tuesday. A small online purchase the weekend before. Nothing unusual. Nothing missing. Nothing that looked like a theft because there was no theft. My account was clean and had always been clean. But the notification I had received on the porch was real. It was a routine activity alert, the kind my bank sent whenever a transaction above a certain amount was flagged for review. It wasn't about my account specifically. It was a general security notification. I switched over to the message Petra had shown my parents. I hadn't seen it clearly in the kitchen, but I had seen enough. Bank transfer. A reference number. My name attached to it somehow. I thought about that word. Somehow. I had not made any transfer from Petra's account. I had never had access to Petra's account. We didn't share banking details. We had never had that kind of arrangement. She had her accounts and I had mine, and the two had never overlapped. So there was a transfer that had my name on it, from an account I had never touched, which meant someone had made it look like me. The more I sat with it, the clearer it became that something about the accusation simply did not fit. I didn't have access to Petra's bank account. I didn't know her password. I had never used her phone or her laptop. We didn't share a computer. I had my own devices and she had hers. And in the 3 years I had lived in that house, I had never once touched her banking app, her cards, or any of her financial information. So how had my name ended up attached to a transfer from her account? Bank transfers don't happen by accident. They require either the account holder's login credentials or a formal instruction that can be traced back to a specific device, a specific location, and a specific time. A name appearing on a transfer didn't mean that person had made it. Could mean many things. Could mean a reference was typed incorrectly. Could mean a payee name was saved under a wrong label. It could mean someone had deliberately attached my name to a transaction they made themselves. I turned that last possibility over carefully. If someone had made a transfer from Petra's account and then attached my name to it as the recipient reference, or had staged the paperwork to suggest I was involved, that required deliberate action. It required someone who knew how the transfer system worked. Someone who had access to the account. Someone who wanted a specific person blamed. I was not that person. But I was beginning to understand who might be. I drove to an all-night petrol station and sat in the car park under the fluorescent lights. I found a notepad in my glove box, the small one I kept for work notes, and I started writing down everything I could remember about that evening. Not emotionally, factually. What time I had arrived home. What time the accusation happened. Who was in the room. What exactly was said and by whom. What I had seen on the kitchen table. The partial view I'd caught of the document my mother had been holding before she turned it face down. I wrote down the timeline of my entire day. When I left the house in the morning. What time I arrived at work. My meeting at 11. Lunch at my desk. The afternoon project review. When I signed out. I was methodical about it the way I was methodical about everything. Not because I was calm. I wasn't calm. My hands were shaking slightly and my chest felt like someone had placed something heavy on it. But I had learned long ago that panic was a luxury that helped no one. If I hadn't done this, then someone had made sure it looked like I did. That was not a situation I could fix with crying or pleading or begging my parents to listen. I had tried speaking in that kitchen and been cut off before the first sentence was finished. The only thing that could fix this was proof. Clear, documented, verifiable proof that told the truth louder than Petra's tears had told a lie. I closed the notepad and started thinking about where that proof might exist. I called my coworker B at 9:30 that night. B was practical and unflappable, the kind of person who responded to a crisis by asking what the immediate next step was rather than what had caused it. I explained briefly. Not everything, but enough. She told me to come over. I stayed in the spare room of her flat that night. She made tea and didn't push me to talk more than I was ready to. She gave me a blanket and told me the sofa pulled out if I needed more space and left me to my thoughts, which was exactly the right thing to do. I lay there in the quiet with the small lamp on and stared at the ceiling. The accusation had happened so fast. That was what kept replaying. The speed of it. The fact that by the time I walked into the kitchen, the verdict had already been delivered. My suitcase was already packed. The door was already open, which meant someone had prepared this in advance. Prepared the accusation, prepared the evidence they were showing my parents, prepared the emotional performance, prepared the exit. This had not been an impulsive moment of panic. This had been planned. Picked up my phone. There was an email I had missed during the drive. It had been forwarded to me by Petra herself, which struck me as strange, and the subject line read, "Transfer confirmation for your records." My finger hovered over it. Then I opened it. The email was formatted like an official bank notification. At the top was the bank's logo and the familiar layout of a transaction confirmation. The details were laid out clearly below. Date of transfer, amount, recipient name, reference code, device confirmation. And there, in the recipient field, was my name, Avery Lane, listed as if I had received the funds from Petra's account. A transfer of £900, time-stamped and documented. Below that was a device note, the kind banks include in security confirmations, stating which device had been used to authorize the transaction. I read through the email 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time slower. The document was designed to look damning. If you were my mother, reading it quickly at the kitchen table while Petra cried beside you, it looked like clear, simple proof. Name. Petra's money. Paper trail. But I had been reading documents carefully for 3 years as part of my job. And when you read carefully, you notice things that a quick glance misses. The timestamp on the transfer was clearly visible. I stared at it. Then I checked my phone calendar. Checked the notes I had written in the petrol station car park about my day. Read the timestamp again. The transfer had been made at 11:47 in the morning. At 11:47 that morning, I had been sitting in a meeting room at work, with 6 other people in the room. I sat up in Bia's spare room and went very still. 11:47 a.m. That was the middle of the project review meeting. The one that ran from 11 until 12:30. The one where I had presented the updated scheduling framework to the team and answered questions for 40 minutes and written notes on the whiteboard that were still there when I left the room. I had been on camera the entire time. Every meeting room in our office building had a standard recording system. It was a security requirement that had been installed 2 years earlier and covered every formal meeting space. The recordings were stored for 90 days. If that transfer had been made at 11:47 while I was sitting in a recorded meeting room surrounded by colleagues, then the footage would show clearly and unambiguously that I was not near any device, not on my phone, not anywhere that could have been used to authorize a bank transaction. It wouldn't just suggest I hadn't done it. It would prove it. I felt something shift inside me then. Not relief exactly. Something more precise than that. The particular feeling of a person who has been thrown into deep water and has just found a surface to push against. I looked at the timestamp one more time to make absolutely certain I had it right. 11:47. I typed a message to my manager, knowing he wouldn't see it until morning, asking if I could speak with him about accessing the meeting room footage. Then I lay back down and, for the first time that night, felt something close to steady. My manager's name was Philip. He was a careful, fair-minded man who had never once in 3 years given me a reason to distrust him. When I arrived at the office the next morning and explained what I needed and broadly why I needed it, He listened without interrupting. He asked one question. "Are you telling me this footage is important to a legal matter?" "It might become one," I said honestly. He nodded once and called the building's facilities coordinator. By 11 o'clock that morning, I was sitting in a small room watching footage from the day before. The timestamp was visible in the corner of the screen. The meeting room was clearly shown, the table, the chairs, the whiteboard, all 6 of my colleagues and me. At 11:44, I was at the whiteboard writing a timeline. At 11:47, the exact minute the transfer had been authorized, I was standing with my back half turned to the camera, marker in hand, talking. My phone was on the table behind me. Touch. Philip watched the footage with me. He didn't say anything for a moment after we confirmed the timestamp. Then he said quietly that he would ensure a certified copy was prepared and that he would sign a supporting statement confirming my attendance if it was needed. I thanked him in a voice that was steadier than I expected. The footage was real. The meeting was documented. The timestamp was clear. I had not made that transfer. And now I could prove it. Once I had the footage confirmed, I went back to my notes and started looking at the larger picture. I had been so focused on the immediate accusation that I hadn't stopped to think about what had been happening around Petra over the past several months. But when I started reviewing what I knew, a pattern began to emerge that I should have noticed earlier. 6 months ago, Petra had asked my mother for money. Not a huge amount, but enough that my mother had mentioned it to me in passing, framing it as Petra going through a rough patch. 3 months after that, I had overheard a phone call in the hallway. Petra's voice, low and tight, saying something about an arrangement being late. 2 months ago, she had sold her car. She told the family she wanted to switch to public transport for environmental reasons. At the time, I had accepted this without question. Last month, she had stopped going out on weekends the way she usually did. She had become quieter, more careful about being in rooms where financial conversations happened. I hadn't connected these things at the time because I was busy with my own life and because I had no reason to suspect anything. But lined up in order, they told a different story than the one my parents had been shown in the kitchen. Petra was in financial trouble. Real trouble. The kind that built slowly and then suddenly needed solving. And something had needed to be solved quickly enough that a plan had been made. I sat with the most uncomfortable possibility for a long time before I let myself say it clearly, even in my own head. My sister had taken the money herself. Not impulsively. Not out of pure desperation in a single weak moment. But deliberately, with enough planning to create a paper trail that pointed at someone else. Enough planning to have the evidence ready, to have our parents primed, to have the suitcase packed before I even walked through the door. She had needed money and she had needed someone to blame for its disappearance. And she had chosen me. The cruelty of it was so precise that it was almost hard to fully absorb. I had covered for Petra in small ways dozens of times over the years. I had lent her money, covered meals, stayed quiet about mistakes I had witnessed. I had been generous with her because she was my sister and I believed that generosity was its own reward. She had taken all of that. The trust, the history, the softness I had offered her, and she had used it to build a story where I was the villain. She had known our parents would believe her. She had planned around that fact. She had weaponized our family's existing dynamic with surgical precision. The question now was not whether it had happened. The evidence was already pointing clearly in one direction. The question was how to prove it in terms that couldn't be dismissed. I found a solicitor through a recommendation from B, whose sister had used her for a contract dispute the previous year. Her name was Elaine Marsden. She had short hair and a direct manner and charged by the hour, which I couldn't entirely afford but would find a way to manage. I sat across from her in her office and laid out everything I had. The accusation, timeline, the timestamp discrepancy, the workplace footage, the pattern of Petra's financial behavior over the previous months. The email that had been forwarded to me by Petra herself, which I noted was a strange thing to do if you were trying to frame someone. Elaine listened and took notes. When I finished, she looked up and asked a few precise questions. Then she set her pen down. "What you're describing," she said, is a false accusation combined with what appears to be deliberate financial fraud. If your sister took money from her own account, staged the transfer record to implicate you, and then reported you to your parents, and potentially to authorities, that is a serious matter. She explained that the evidence I had was a strong starting foundation. The footage, the timestamp, my attendance record, the device details in the email confirmation. If this goes to court, she said, the truth will come out through disclosure. The other side will be required to produce the actual device logs and transaction records. And if those don't match the story being told, it becomes very difficult to maintain. I nodded slowly. Then we make sure it goes somewhere that requires the whole truth, I said. 10 days after I was thrown out of the house, Petra filed a formal complaint with the police. I found out through a letter that arrived at Bia's address. I had updated my contact details immediately after the first night, almost by instinct, as if some part of me had known this might escalate. The letter informed me that a fraud investigation had been opened in connection with an alleged unauthorized bank transfer, and that I would be required to attend a voluntary interview. Called Elaine immediately. She told me not to panic and not to attend any interview without her present. She said a voluntary interview was still serious and needed to be treated accordingly. She said the fact that a formal complaint had been made was actually useful because it now created a formal process, and formal processes required evidence from both sides. I wasn't panicking. I want to be clear about that. What I felt when I read that letter was something colder and more specific than panic. It was the recognition that Petra had actually believed this would work. That she had sat somewhere, her bedroom maybe or a cafe, and thought through the steps of making this an official legal matter, and had concluded she was safe enough to do it. She actually thought she was going to get away with this. That belief would turn out to be the most significant miscalculation she had ever made. Because she had just moved this from a family argument, where emotion could do the work, into a system where emotion meant nothing and evidence meant everything. I tried to reach my parents once. Only once. I sent my mother a text message. Not long, not emotional. Just 3 sentences. I told her I had evidence that placed me at work at the exact time the transfer occurred. I told her I was working with a solicitor. I told her I would welcome a conversation if she was willing to hear the other side. She did not reply. My father didn't reply either. I hadn't messaged him directly, but I knew my mother would tell him. The silence from both of them in the days that followed was complete and total. No call, no text, not even a message passed through a relative. They had chosen their position and they were staying inside it. What hurt most wasn't the silence. It was what the silence confirmed. My parents hadn't thrown me out in a moment of raw, confused emotion that they were now quietly reconsidering. They had done it with intention and they were standing by it. The possibility that they could be wrong had not, apparently, been given serious consideration. They had not just believed Petra. They had stopped believing in me so completely that no counter-evidence I offered had even been worth a reply. I sat with that for a few days. I let it hurt the way it needed to. Then I put it aside and went back to work. The people who were going to clear my name were not my parents. They were a solicitor, a manager with security footage access, and the digital records that Petra had assumed no one would look at carefully. Elaine called me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me the formal investigation had moved forward and that a court date had been set. The complaint had been escalated rather than resolved at interview stage, which she said sometimes happened when the investigating officer felt the matter was significant enough to require a hearing. She told me to come in the following morning because she had found something new. I was at her office before 9. She had been conducting her own research into the digital side of the transaction. As part of the formal complaint process, the bank had been required to submit full records, and Elaine had worked with a digital forensics consultant who specialized in financial transaction analysis. The consultant had found something in the device metadata. Every bank transfer made through an app leaves a trace. Not just the timestamp, the device identifier, the operating system version, the network connection, the location data if the device has location services active. Elaine slid a printed summary across her desk toward me. The transfer was made from a specific device, she said. That device has been identified through its unique identifier number. I looked at the page. And the device doesn't belong to me, I said. Not a question. Already knew. No, Elaine said. It doesn't. She let that sit for a moment, then added. We now need to establish who that device belongs to. The device belonged to Petra. Elaine confirmed it on the following Tuesday after the forensics consultant completed the cross-reference. The unique device identifier in the transaction metadata matched a phone registered under Petra's name on her mobile network contract. The network records showed the device had been connected to a home Wi-Fi network, the network at my parents' house, at the time of the transfer. Not my phone. Not my account. Not my location. Her phone. Her home. Her network. Her transaction. She had made the transfer from her own device, from her own account, and then reported it as if I had accessed her account without permission. The reference field on the transfer, the part that had my name on it, had been manually typed by whoever made the transfer. Anyone can type any name into a reference field. Proves nothing about who sent the money. What the device logs proved was everything. Elaine was careful in how she explained what this meant. She didn't use words like conclusive or guaranteed because good solicitors don't overpromise. But she said that the combination of the device logs, my workplace footage, the timestamp alignment, and the manual nature of the name reference created a body of evidence that was going to be very difficult for Petra's side to counter. She didn't cover her tracks well enough, Elaine said. I nodded slowly. She didn't think she needed to, I replied. She had been so certain of the story she was telling and the family dynamic she was hiding behind that she hadn't considered the possibility that someone would look past it. The week before the hearing, I focused entirely on preparation. Elaine and I went through everything methodically. The workplace footage and Philip's supporting statement. The bank's full transaction records showing no access from any device registered to me. The device forensics report identifying Petra's phone as the origin of the transfer. My own bank records for the full 3 months prior, clean and unambiguous. The timeline of events from the morning I was thrown out through every step since. I also gathered the contextual evidence. The records of Petra's financial behavior over the previous months. Car sale. The pattern of borrowing. A statement from a mutual family friend who had mentioned to me, weeks before any of this happened, that Petra had seemed stressed about money. None of that proved fraud by itself. But alongside the device logs, it filled in the outline of why. Elaine told me not to expect the hearing to be easy. Even with strong evidence, she said, court hearings were unpredictable. Witnesses could be persuasive. Emotions still had weight even in formal settings. I told her I understood. I wasn't going in expecting easy. I was going in expecting honest. She looked at me for a moment. You're very calm for someone in your situation, she said. I've had 2 weeks to be angry, I said. I used it all up. Now I just need this to be over and done with truthfully. She nodded. Then we're ready. I arrived at the court building on a gray Tuesday morning. The kind of day that doesn't take sides, cold and flat and overcast, the sort of sky that just watches. I wore a plain dark jacket and carried Elaine's folder under my arm. Elaine met me at the entrance and we walked in together without speaking much. She had said everything that needed saying. What was left now was simply what happened in the room. My parents were already inside. They were sitting on the far side of the public seating area, close together the way people sit when they're holding each other up. My mother looked tired. My father looked rigid, the way he got when he was uncomfortable but had committed to a position he didn't know how to step back from. They saw me when I walked in. I know they did because I watched both of them look up and then look away. Not quickly, slowly, like looking away was an effort. I didn't look away from them. I held their direction for a moment and then turned my attention forward. Petra was already seated. She was dressed carefully, hair neat, posture straight. She had the controlled stillness of someone who had rehearsed for this. When I entered, she glanced at me and I saw it, the smallest flash of something. Not guilt. Not yet. Just the recalculation of a person checking whether the situation was still the way they had left it. She looked confident, prepared. She still believed she was safe. Petra testified first. She had been advised by her own solicitor, and she spoke clearly and steadily, describing the discovery of the missing money, her distress, her certainty that only someone with knowledge of her financial details could have done it. She described our relationship as close. She described the discovery as devastating. She cried at one point, controlled tears, arriving exactly where they would have the most effect. She talked about how hard it had been to come forward against her own sister, how she had hoped she was wrong, how she had checked and rechecked the records before going to her parents. It was a strong performance. Genuinely strong. I could feel the weight of it in the room, the way the air shifted slightly as people responded to the image she was building. I sat and listened to every word without reacting. Elaine had told me to stay completely neutral regardless of what was said, and I did. Neutral face, steady hands, still posture. But I noticed something even as I stayed still. Petra was being specific about the things she had prepared to be specific about and vague about everything else. Her testimony had shape and detail in certain places and then became soft and approximate the moment questions moved toward the technical record. She knew the story she was telling. She didn't know the full shape of the evidence that was coming. Elaine rose from her seat. For the first time since we walked in, I exhaled slowly. Elaine was methodical and unhurried. She didn't begin dramatically. She simply started with the workplace footage. Philip's certified statement was submitted first, confirming the recording system, the retention period, and my attendance at the meeting on the day in question. Then the footage itself was shown, timestamp visible and clear, covering the window between 11 and 12:30. There I was. The whiteboard. At the table. In the room. Continuously, without any gap, for the entire period that included the 11:47 timestamp on the transfer. Elaine let the footage play long enough to be undeniable. Then she moved to the bank records. My own records first. 3 months of clean transactions with no transfer to or from Petra's account at any point. Then the device metadata from Petra's transfer, which the bank had been required to produce in full as part of the disclosure process. She walked through each element carefully. The device identifier, the registration match, the network connection, the location data confirming the device was at the family home address at the time of the transaction. The room had been paying moderate attention during Petra's testimony. Now it was paying a different kind of attention. The focused, quiet kind that happens when something shifts. I watched Petra's face across the room. The confidence was still there, but it had become effortful. Like a door being held shut against something pushing from the other side. For the first time since the kitchen, she looked like she wasn't sure of the outcome anymore. The final piece was the simplest and the most devastating. Elaine submitted the bank's complete transaction log, pulled directly from Petra's account history through the formal disclosure order. Not the email that Petra had forwarded to me. Not a screenshot or a printout she had prepared. The direct institutional record from the bank itself. The transaction was listed exactly as it had appeared in the confirmation email. Same amount, same timestamp, same reference. My name in the reference field. But the bank's internal log also showed something the email confirmation had not. The full authentication trail. The login credentials used. The device. The session record showing the account access beginning at 11:39 and the transfer being made at 11:47 and the session closing at 11:52. A single device had been used from login to logout. The device registered to Petra. At Petra's address. There was no second session. There was no remote access. There was no point at which any other device had been involved. The court went very still. I did not look at Petra. I looked straight ahead. But in my peripheral vision I could see the shape of her, and the shape had changed. The careful posture had folded slightly. Her solicitor leaned toward her and said something quiet and she didn't respond. My parents sat frozen. My mother's hand was over her mouth. In the silence, Petra tried to speak. She said something about the logs being wrong, about the bank making an error, about there being an explanation. The words came out thin and uneven. They didn't sound like the truth. And everyone in the room could hear the difference. Petra's testimony collapsed within the first few questions of cross-examination. She had prepared for the emotional version of this hearing, the one where her tears and her certainty carried the room. She had not prepared for the technical version. When Elaine pressed her on the device logs, on the authentication trail, on the session record, Petra's answers became contradictions wrapped around other contradictions. First she said the logs must be inaccurate. Then she said the bank must have made a technical error. Then she said she didn't understand how the system worked, which was the first honest thing she had said all morning, except that her own transfer confirmation email demonstrated she understood it well enough to use it and well enough to forward it. The contradictions accumulated. Every answer she gave created a new inconsistency that needed another answer to explain it, and each new explanation made the previous one impossible. At some point in the middle of it, the whole constructed thing simply stopped holding. Her solicitor stopped her from answering one question and requested a brief recess. When they returned, the tone from her side of the room had changed entirely. My parents had been sitting still through all of this. I hadn't looked at them directly since the footage started playing. But in the moment when the truth became impossible to ignore, I finally did look. My father had his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the floor. My mother was looking at me, just looking, like someone trying to remember something they had chosen to forget. Outside the courthouse, the gray morning had cleared slightly. A thin line of light was showing at the edge of the clouds. Not full sun, just enough. The outcome had been what the evidence demanded. The transaction was found to have originated from Petra's own device with no evidence of external access. The formal complaint against me was dismissed. The matter was referred for further investigation regarding the source and nature of the original allegation. Petra and her solicitor left quickly through a side exit. My parents were slower. I was standing near the entrance when they came through the door. My father saw me first and stopped. My mother came up beside him and stopped too. They stood about 4 feet away from me and neither of them spoke immediately. My father opened his mouth. I spoke first. "You didn't just believe her," I said. My voice was quiet and level. I had thought about this moment for 2 weeks and I had decided I wasn't going to shout. Shouting was for people who still needed to be heard. I just needed to be honest. You chose not to believe me. You packed my suitcase before I walked through the door. You didn't ask one question. My mother started to say something. I saw her forming the words. I stepped back. "I know you're sorry," I said. "But sorry doesn't change what that night felt like. And it doesn't change what I now understand about how you see me." I turned and walked down the steps toward where Elaine was waiting. They threw me out when I needed them most. And the truth didn't bring me back to them. It showed me clearly and finally why I should never return.